The overall theme of CogX this year is how do we get the next 10 years right? How do we invent, master and manage a new world where creativity meets technology? How do we manage the recovery from the pandemic right now? We've talked a lot over the last 2 days about what the new normal will look like. In the next half hour, we're hoping to show you how. We have two 15-minute presentations about the impact of COVID-19 on consumer attitudes and behaviour. We look at cultural and consumer trends and what it means for brands and businesses. We look at the universal human truths that unite us and how they inform our creative response. These presentations are based on quantitative tracking studies from two world-leading companies. In the spirit of our theme of East meets West, they come from both sides of the world. First, we have a pre-recorded video session from Kantar, China, featuring Eric Tan and Panos Dimitropoulous from the Semiotics and Cultural Practice at Kantar. And then we move swiftly into a live session from McCann, London, with Harjot Singh, Chief Strategy Officer, UK and Europe. Please play the video.
Hello everyone, this is Eric Tang, the Chief Client Officer of Kantar Insights in China. Great to share and exchange lessons to uncover growth post-COVID-19. There are certainly strong signs to indicate that China's economy and business is recovering. The Kantar's leading global C19 barometer tracks people's attitudes, behaviors, and expectations across more than 50 markets since March. Findings shows economy anxiety levels across the world remain high, but are receding from their peak. 35% of consumers no longer feel the impact of epidemic on their lives. Chinese consumers' confidence is returning. Domestic travel confidence has risen by 60% in the past 2 weeks. More than 15.68 billion yuan was paid out on the 24 hours on May 5 shopping festival. Shanghai's food and beverage consumption has increased by 45% compared with that before the shopping festival. China indeed has a significant head start now. Kantar have identified three major trends that will remain sticky to shape consumers' post-pandemic behavior. The crisis has accelerated concerns of financial security that brought up new quest for value consciousness towards the new and shifting demands. 45% of families were financially affected during the outbreak. Kantar believes that specifying the right pricing, promotion, and value-added strategies will be key to improving brand competitiveness. Online marketing and sales proved to be resilient through the epidemic and the crisis. E-commerce became a mainstream. 38% of respondents said they would continue to use the e-commerce platform. This warranted our audit to our e-commerce capability and better fast-track now than ever. China may just be the best chance that global brands have for any growth in 2020. Strong sign of consumer returning to domestic preferences. 65% of respondents preferred products made locally. So brands that want post-recovery thrive need to quickly connect with customers to understand their new normals and to change attitudes as a result. There are three major trends that instigated three key lessons. How to reform brands on the path to the next normal, meeting shifting demands, e-commerce fulfillment, and building irresistible brand. First, meet shifting demands. Discounting is tempting during recession, but it creates downward pressure on margins. So be creative about pricing despite higher consciousness on price. How does your brand deliver value? Chanel in China successfully created talk of town by bringing consumers queue up a day before the price increase. Long queues of consumers are there, awaiting for the existing bag range before the price hike. Yet there are new ranges of higher priced handbags launched the day after that advocate newness and enhance consumers' brand experience. Not only that, these pricing decisions brought in sales traffic short term, but it also protect and enhance the overall brand perception. Growing attention towards health and wellness also reshape purchasing behavior in the longer run. Consumer continues to raise their awareness on health and awareness post-COVID-19. Ready-to-drink food brands anticipate the future new channel by collaborating with medical brands to launch healthy ramen and in-home hot pot. This innovation is going to reshape their lifestyle and consumption behavior. Lesson 2. E-commerce fulfillment. The new era of e-commerce will mean faster, fresher, cheaper, more variety available to everyone, everywhere. The O2O platform successfully recruit new users and gain frequency of usage. Frequency of app usage in China has reported to 2 times per day during C19 and continues post-outbreak. Fresh Hema reported 127% growth in daily active users. Sales of fresh food at Jingdong increased by 215%, reaching almost 15,000 tons during a 7-day period. Setting up your success on e-commerce means building trust by reassuring people on the safety of manufacturing capabilities, and product availability checks online and offline via online shopping tools, and also adjusting product portfolio, creating product bundles to make buying easier to cater for bulk orders and safety new buying habits. We will see more brands and e-commerce stores like Fresh Hema and Miss Fresh collaborating to enhance better experiences riding on the homebound economy. Go-to-market is also very important, so brands can activate different triggers at different phases of the purchase journey to push consumers to purchase. Live streaming becomes the key tactic during C19 to quickly convert consumers from priming stage to purchase. Audiences of Taobao live stream increased by 43% during C19. Advisors from offline stores also start doing live streaming with more than 50 brands participating. More than 100,000 audiences watched the first live streaming show from these Advisors Plus, roughly equal to 6 months traffic. Sales performance of one 3-hour show is roughly equal to a week in online stores. Lesson 3. Building irresistible brand. Quality brands with high social responsibility gain respect from consumers, ultimately building stronger, irresistible brand bias. In consumer attitudes towards brands, they voice that they are more likely to purchase brands that are quality and socially responsible. So brands are winning consumers' heart due to their efforts of offering high level of service and product during C19. So you need either to make a stand or be purposeful. Making a stand by promoting collaboration. How can a brand help small business when they are most impacted? Amazon, Uber, and tech brands Dell, Cisco in China and also in US launched their Stand to Small in April till now. And they've been helping and actually showing a lot of social responsibility. Be purposeful. Starbucks is a very, very good example by having and launching their Good campaign, trying to actually share their hope and showing good for themselves, good for the earth, and let good change good can be integrated into everyone's daily life, offer sustainable attitudes towards life. Next, I'll pass the time to Panos, our cultural intelligence and foresight lead in APAC region, sharing how cultural intelligence can help to build irresistible brand in the new normal. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Panos Dimitropoulous. I'm head of cultural intelligence and foresight for Kantar Consulting in China, and I will be following up from Eric's point on irresistible brand growth. One way of doing this is looking at culture. Culture not only is helping us facilitate a better conversation with brands and consumers, building a more deeper relationship between the two, but also it helps us understand radical changes of meaning, radical changes of macro factors, such as the ones that have been happening in China for the last few decades, such as the one that is COVID-19. So what we did is we analyzed a lot of contents, more than 2,000 pieces of post-COVID-19 content, ranging from across brand categories, advertising, media, statements, and so on, all the way to social media user-generated content, as well as the latest art and design content that we found happening in the last few months. What that gave us was specific cultural trends and branding strategies for helping brands understand how to communicate and create a better positioning. The first of that has been about scientific and technological efficacy. So what we notice is, whereas before science and technology have been shifting towards gentle and sensitive representations, such as science becoming very closely in harmony with nature, creating a best of both worlds, such as specific ideas of purity being represented in a very soft manner, and technology being seen in a much more warm and humane kind of aspect, all of these now have been changing into a much more potent effect. We see a lot of medical and medicinal purity and potency being communicated and being adopted by brands that are not even traditional brands in health and wellness category. And of course, we see a lot of technology being used in a much more immersive and potent kind of way, creating the very much needed passage from reality into a much more idealized form of escapism. The second trend that we looked at has to do with Chinese strength and pride. Now, this is something that we have been noticing pre-COVID-19 happening, the idea of tradition being important in the way brands are communicating, or in the way that Western brands are trying to localize content in China. But that has been happening in a much superfluous kind of way, either focusing on specific traditional elements such as traditional Chinese medicine, or using it in a very silly manner, in a very light-hearted way of communication. After and during, actually, post-COVID, during COVID-19, we have noticed the idea of Chinese being very proud of overcoming this crisis due to specific characteristics that have been adopted, that have been attributed to specific areas of their past, to specific heritage that has been influencing their cultural DNA. And this creates a much more needed and active connection between history and the present, creating a much more needed historical continuity and a much more active contribution of the past into the present in order to create a better future. So we're seeing specific characteristics attributed to specific cultural areas or historical areas, if you like, that are being used by brands in order to communicate the brand benefits, in order to communicate specific consumer activation, specific consumer enablements, such as the historical bravery and heroism of ancient China, or the idea of social efficiency, social discipline, in order to create a much more prosperous and more efficient present that has been attributed to the communist era. The third idea is about caring humanism. Whereas before individualism has been a big shift that has been influencing the way identity has been represented, especially when talking to consumers, through harsh visuals, through ideas of going against conventions, through sharp and tough attitudes, to communicate strong individual enablement. We see now that after post-COVID-19, there is an idea of much more soft, gentle, honest, and caring treatments of what it means to be human. The idea of humanity, the idea of the value and preciousness of preserving humanity has taken precedence and has been replacing more harsh ideas of individualism. Finally, it is all about meaningful positivity. So the idea is, before COVID-19, there has been a much more carelessness and the idea of enjoying the moment, especially for young generations. So they have been creating content that has to do with silly humor, with the idea of carefree celebrations of people having fun. This also has been shifting. Due to COVID-19, we see a lot of content of people spending time indoors, but using that time in a much more meaningful way, using that time in order to create a betterment of personalities, a much more intellectual humor, creating a much more self and positive energy and optimism in a way that is creating better selves from themselves, as well as much more ideas of intellectuality and individuality being used in a much more constructive way. Such is the three lessons, going back to the three lessons that we wanted to give you, was about brands that want to create a path to the next normal, has to be meeting shifting demands, and e-commerce fulfillment, and building irresistible brands. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really very, very happy to join you and share with you this next the presentation of findings called Culture and COVID. As Janet says, we're bringing you a perspective from the West primarily, but this is based on a global study, so we will make a few references. And just before we jump in, I just want to say that this isn't so much as just another COVID study as much as it is a cultural commentary on how it's impacting us as human beings and what kind of implications and opportunities that throws up for brands, organizations, or platforms to just connect with people in a better, more authentic way. And the other thing I want to tell you is that if there's one thing we've learned is that sometimes even the most fundamental things get amplified and the most obvious truths present the most brilliant opportunities to do something very, very deeply meaningful. So think about this as a way and a provocation to just tune back into the human condition versus a research presentation. So on that note, Matt is driving, so I might ask him a couple of times to just hit the slide. So bear with me. So Matt, can we get into the presentation? Thank you. Like I said, it's about human truths about culture and COVID-19. And it's brought to you by our thought leadership unit called Truth Central, which is part of McCann Worldgroup. And it is the discipline that really invests in understanding research and insight on a global scale on subjects and matters that impact people in the most human and fundamental ways. Okay. Yeah, so we've Truth Central, this is just one of many studies. So to date, over the last 7 years, we've invested in over 22 studies across 29 markets. We've had over 225 bespoke workshops with clients and platforms and organizations and governments, really. And we have about 25 million proprietary data points that we can refer to. Subjects from diversity to privacy to beauty to commerce to global brands. So it's a real spectrum of subjects that we've invested in. Okay. Next slide, please. So this study covered about 16 markets, and wave one was about 16 markets all over the world, like I said, and they include some markets in Asia as well, as you can see. So 16 markets, about 14,000 people in wave one, and we have every 2 weeks been, updating our study and going back into the markets and seeing what the shifts are. Because there's one thing for sure, if this is a pandemic, but it's affecting everyone so uniquely, and every day things change, and what's unique and known and accepted today is just completely upended tomorrow. So things are developing on a daily basis, and we're keeping track of it on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So as I said, the pandemic has really upended the world. Next slide. 1 in 2 people across the world believe that the world will be forever changed by this. And that really over-indexes in markets like the US and the UK. So really no new truths over here, but just the severity of what's going on. Next slide, please. So what's the bright spot, you might ask? The bright spot, if you look at the study and we look at all our interviews and all the research, we've learned that there are about 5 big things that are coming or emerging as, the possible benefits, if you want to call it that, of COVID-19. The first one being that we will consider what really matters in life. So it's forcing a level of re-introspection and just looking inward. We'll spend more time with our families. The carbon emissions will go down. In fact, I don't know if you've read recently, but markets like Germany have already met their 2020 greenhouse gas emission targets because of the slowdown and the fact that there was a lockdown. So there are countries that are really accelerating the degree of progress that they've made over COVID-19 to kind of meet some of their environmental goals. People will focus on their faith. This is largely driven by the US, really, and there'll be lots of good memes, and that's really, it's something where we've known that this has provided some level of comic relief in this moment as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about the human need to find amusement, entertainment, and levity, even in the worst situations. So more than 1 in 3 people believe that this crisis will inspire new innovations. And that's really the first thing I want to talk about. And this does, it's heightened in markets like China and Japan. In fact, one of the things to think about, I was speaking to a very wise lady the other day, and she said something about this crisis, you can view it as either being a sort of a chrysalis or a cocoon, really, where you'll emerge from it reborn and transformed, or you can look at it as a box or a container. And I think what we're learning is that we're finding more and more people looking at this crisis and looking at the constraints that it's caused us as a reason to reinvent, reimagine, and recreate. So here's a quick look at the Global Pandemic Journey Map. Well, the Global Pandemic Journey Map is really an attempt from our research and analytics team to use our data to try and understand the trajectory that markets are following when it comes to the pandemic. This map essentially shows how individual nations are advancing through a cycle of behaviors and emotions that are triggered by the current crisis. So that's what this is about. In the last several months, the world has been struck by a series of deeply intertwined crises. We've looked at this, that it just hasn't been one thing. It started as a health crisis, and then there's an economic crisis, there's been a political crisis, and then there's been a psychological crisis. And there's this conversation around mental health, there's this conversation around trust in institutions and governments waning, and how we're feeling let down by them, and how we need to really reassess the fact that we have no agency in determining our future and that leadership needs to live up. There's all this conversation about the economic recession and the fact that it is going to be quite permanent, and how it's worse than what we've seen over the last 100 years. And of course, there's the health crisis. Not only has it affected everyone, but there's so much conversation about how marginalized communities have been affected to a much greater degree. And there's just been so much of death and sickness around us across the world. So this is really what the pandemic map looks like. The containment index is really based on publicly available data, and the crisis index is really how we're mapping how people are engaging with the crisis and what the mood of the countries really is. And we're trying to map a path to recovery and what the human needs are and what are the opportunities therein. Okay. So when we've assessed the human condition and we've looked at research and we've looked at our body of work, we believe that human beings go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stages anytime you're in crisis or trauma. Like, this isn't research, like I said. Don't think about, you know, looking at this as research, but my objective and intention is to kind of compel you to really tune into the human condition and just think about it. We've all been through hard times, and we all know what it is to kind of be in a state of trauma or be traumatized, and then know what it is to come out of it as well. And there's always, whether it's grief, it's physical or mental anguish, whatever that is, we go through a stage of discovering and denying. We go through a stage of panicking, then we get into a stage of adapting, and we get into a stage of recovery and renewal. But the point that I want to make here is not so much about recovery, but our discourse is about renewal, because renewal, I feel, is both optimistic and also respectful. Not because it's not just about ignoring the past, but really about respecting what has worked and pulling those forward, and then being optimistic to the change that we can co-create. Okay. So if you look at that, so these aren't such linear stages. I'm sure everyone in the audience can relate that we don't just go from panic to adapt. Often that's the little cyclone or the vicious cycle. You're panicking, then you're adapting, and then you panic again, and then you adapt again, because suddenly something that you knew is no longer true. And we're in that constant cycle. And I think that's something that's really not spoken about as much and with as much honesty as we ought to. So when we did wave 3, as you imagine, that was about 6 or 8 weeks into the study. That's wave 3 because we're repeating every 2 weeks. I can't, so you have to forgive me. I have reached the age where I can't read that closely, but I'm sure you can. So you can see some of the markets over there that were panicking and adapting that stage, how those markets, and you see where China is, and you see Germany and Italy quite close to between adapting and recovering. And then you see markets like Spain moving up from panic to adapting, and France a little bit more ahead, and the US and the UK. Funnily enough, when we tracked the study, the UK was never panicking to the degree, and I think that's in my opinion, that's something, because it says something about us as a society. We're not very good with panicking. So I think that's just another side thing, but you can see some of the markets over there. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see how the picture changes. Wave 4, you see some of the markets that were further ahead have slipped, and then some that were not so not so further ahead, or were further ahead, are exchanging spaces and places, because it's just, so the point here is it continues to change, but the direction is to move towards recovery and renewal. And it's interesting, if you tap and tag the brands and businesses around it, we can actually then start identifying opportunities. So for example, you want to talk to consumers in Germany, what's the discourse and what's the narrative that you should be tapping into? If you want to talk to people in Canada or in the UK, what's the mood of the country, and what are the sensibilities that we should be tuned into? This really helps us make that available to our clients and to our partners. Okay, next slide. So let's quickly get into human truths in a time of coronavirus. It's really an overview because we've only got, I imagine, like 10 more minutes left. I just want to talk to you about the fact that this is a bigger study, and there are 5 basic fundamental human needs that we've identified. If you go to the next slide. These are the 5 human truths that define us as human beings. It doesn't matter where we are, how rich, how poor, what we look like, and what we've been through, what we're going through. This is really what sums up the human condition. Being a human being means to be in pursuit of connection, to be in pursuit of love, to be in pursuit of discovery, and to be always motivated and enchanted by the need for discovery, to be in pursuit of some sense of meaning and purpose, and to be in pursuit of some level of success. And we know this, that every time brands and platforms want to connect with people, we have to tap into these needs, sometimes at the intersection of 1, 2, or 3 needs, or sometimes zeroing in on one need in particular. So all human truths really lie at the center of these needs and need states that define us as human beings. So in the interest of time today, we're going to talk about 3 of them. But like I said, if you're interested in knowing more, you can get in touch with us. And also the top 3 that we're going to talk about today, we're just really going to go very, very broad strokes. And so you get an idea about the kind of investigation and the kind of information that we've looked at. But there's rigorous quantitative data to back up each of these. Okay, let's go quickly into it. Number 1, connection in a time of coronavirus. So if you look at connection in time of coronavirus, and we asked, what does that really mean for you? And when there was a question in the study, if you were to sum it up in one word, maximum 2, what does this whole thing mean to you? And it's quite interesting that in Ireland, when you look at the contrast, like markets like Germany or Poland, where you talk about social distancing, and strict lockdown, and police hours, you have something like cocooning that comes up in markets like Ireland. So the human need for connection is really impossible to silence. That's the first truth. So if we go to the next one. CEO of Verizon, Hans Westberg, said that we've had about 800 million calls a day. That's double the amount of calls you would have had on Mother's Day, which is the busiest of the year. So this is just on March 27th, which is we've just been a couple of weeks into this. That's the kind of information that's been out there. And so that just tells you how much people have wanted to connect with each other. Okay. So there's also been a renewed sense of local connection, not just about calling relatives and family that are far away, but a much more renewed sense of local connection. And if you look at that, I think these are a couple of videos, but they're not really videos, but I'm sure you've seen these memes where in Italy, people are serenading their neighbors or finding very innovative ways to toast each other and finding hacks to kind of, connect with each other in really interesting ways. And this really, really did make my heart happy when I saw this. This is another one where people have actually, this is, if you look at this meme, this is someone from our team shot this. And this is really, people got these long bamboo sticks and they've got those little clothes hangers and they've got little Prosecco glasses and they're cheering neighbors across the street. And that's just my need for connection will not be silenced. You can't muzzle the human need for connection, okay? So the coronavirus, at the same time as it's brought people together and this human need for connection, it's also exposed the fault lines in our society. If you look at what I mean by that is it's exposed what the most vulnerable people, who the most vulnerable people are, and the degree to which we're affected, and also the degree to which there is imbalance and inequity and structured inequality in society. So whether that's a generation war is brewing over coronavirus in the Wall Street Journal about the US, or in Brazil about indigenous fear of ethnocide. In the UK, there's a disproportionate impact on BAME groups. It's been in our news and we've been talking about it, and it's becoming bigger and bigger of an issue. It's exposing other fault lines in British society. In India, things like the future's scary, the poor are hit hardest by Indian coronavirus lockdown, which is basically a global trend. Okay. So 1 in 3 people across the world are globally concerned that the vulnerable people will become more isolated during this time. The reason this over-indexes in the UK is because in the UK, we do have a problem, a heightened problem and well-documented problem of loneliness. And there are more people, and that's one of the biggest health issues in our country, where people feel like loneliness is a pandemic. So this really does come up over there. So the truth really is, the number one, I'm going to talk to you about 3 truths. The number 1 truth is, as the pandemic spreads, people are at once more connected and more isolated than ever before. So we're unified in our isolation, our isolation unites us. And I never thought we would ever say this, but that's really the most interesting and most fundamental truth that talks about culture in COVID, is we're united by our isolation. The implication really is, very quickly, question to ask ourselves is, how can we encourage genuine connections, promote an exchange of ideas, and ensure that we're having fun and staying healthy along the way? It sounds like a simple question, but it begs a lot of thinking. The second truth that I want to talk to you about is discovery in a time of coronavirus. Discovery is really the human need to go and explore and to find new roads and to find new ideas and to just connect with that creativity that resides deep within each of us. So the first thing where we're seeing this, how it manifests in coronavirus, is that it's created this quest for finding a cure, scientists across countries that haven't traditionally collaborated to the degree they are now. It's almost there's a healthy race and a healthy competition about who's going to get the virus, the vaccine first. And people are collaborating more, people are innovating more. There's a lot more conversation that's solution-based and innovation-based. So whether that's, in the quest for vaccine, the US makes a big bet on the company with unproven technology, so there's risk, or whether there's, conversation around next 300 million vials, and that's the target on what they want to achieve. So there's just a lot of innovation going on. And as the outside world closed in, people were then forced to turn inwards. And we'll talk about that just now. So my favorite quote from this study is that someone said to us, life is cancelled. And I just think it's a bumper sticker on the mood of how people feel about this, that life is cancelled. Then if you go to the next one, this is my other favorite one. It's not so much about time out, but it's about time in. So time in, speaking about that, 42% of the people globally, and this over-indexes in Europe, say that their home is their sanctuary. If you go to the next slide, I'll have more time to reveal and discover myself is the conversation in Russia. And the reason we've talked about that is this is quite different for Russian culture. Russia is very much a collective society because of the, the background and the culture that exists within there. So for people to look inward, and when we talk to respondents in Russia, we've learned that this was quite an exceptional sentiment in that market. And the other thing, I don't know if you heard, Riz Ahmed on the Business of Fashion podcast said, who would we be without our voices, without our career, without our expressions? And so that's really the question we're all asking ourselves. Who would we be as humans if we didn't have our external expression and our external jobs and our external careers? And that's really a time to focus on ourselves. So 1 in 6 people globally say that they've discovered a better version of themselves during coronavirus. And this is, markets like China and India, this is really over-indexing as well. And massively, the reason these markets have been pulled out is because this is a theme over there, and the difference from where the sentiment was and where it is, it's a pretty significant jump. In the rest of Europe, people also feel that this is compelling them to go inward. There's just a resurgence of meditation apps, people actually reflecting on their relationships. There's this whole conversation in UK and in European countries where you're hearing from people like exes or friends that you feel that you've had fallouts with or have felt betrayed by, are reconnecting and are going through. There's a whole trend of some of the most beautiful apologies and reconnections during COVID. So people are really rediscovering a better version of themselves. And if you have something to offer that allows them to do that, you will connect meaningfully with them. 1 in 6 people say that they've started a new hobby, reading, painting, etc. Again, no surprise over here. But the big thing over here, I know some of you might have watched the TikTok presentation as well. You see that a lot more user-generated content. And last I read, there has been a spike in creativity. There's never been that much more creative content coming from the world over at a speed at which it is coming. The number of poetry submissions has gone up significantly in markets like France and the UK, where people are submitting more writing samples. There are a lot more call for entries. People are making more art. So that's really a recurring theme. So it's really unleashing a torrent of creativity, to say the least. And this is just a really funny example, not funny, but I love this because these are people from our own teams. And this is an art challenge that's been going on, and it's going on everywhere in the world. In Europe, it's been really, really big, this art challenge about people wanting to replicate famous paintings. And so these are some of our own team mates who have recreated some of the most famous paintings in the world. If you go to the next one, this is really funny as well, and true and lighthearted, but quite profound. The flower is the new toilet roll, and we all know about the whole toilet roll situation with coronavirus and how it was just like panic buying, and then now people have unleashed themselves. So much creativity in baking and making as well. The amount of bread making and sourdough conversations on the internet are really, really proof of this. So the truth is that a crisis can unleash unparalleled creativity and innovation. In uncertain times, the need for discovery, the need for joy and escapism must not be underestimated. And I feel that sometimes we often think that, oh, it might be too lighthearted to talk about joy and escapism. It's not. It's a fundamental human need. Next slide, please. So the implication is, how can brands therefore best learn from people's behavior during the pandemic and use them as a springboard for long-term innovation? If we had more time, I would have shown you a few examples, but I can say it makes me really happy to tell you a lot of brands are getting this right now. Next slide. The last one I want to talk to you today about is purpose in a time of coronavirus. Purpose really is our reason to exist. No, you don't need more commentary from me on what purpose is, but the way it relates to us as human beings is a need to really reassert, reassess, and reclaim a sense of meaning that justifies why we are who we are and what our mission is in this world and in the context of our relationships and just our humanity, so to speak. Next slide. Crises put into sharp focus what really, really matters. Again, this is a human truth. We know that. 2 in 3 people globally say that they'd rather change their life to reflect what they've learned before versus go back to life as it was before. And this is a really important thing. And I think if you talk about what this means for brands, it's really important to understand there is no, the idea about let's go back to how things were is an outdated concept. People do not want to go back. In fact, there's a very famous sociologist, and I can't remember who right now, but I read somewhere this idea that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. A disaster is really the outcome of the way things were, and because they were arranged in a way that were going to cause an inevitable disaster. So every time something like a pandemic or a disaster happens, we can't expect to ever go back to the way things were, because the way things were is what has contributed to this in the first place. So that really is the discourse in culture right now, that people would rather change their life, make adjustments, downsize, right size, or a new word that's engaging, that's coming up in the marketing and business world is this idea of futurescaping. So people would rather do all of that than to go back to how things were the way they were before. And new heroes have emerged. And again, this is really an interesting time, because we learned about a year ago when we did our big global brand study that the trust in institutions was waning, and people had more expectations from brands than they had from governments and traditional institutions. And what we're realizing now is that is now beginning to swing in their favor, in a good direction, because the trust and expectations in institutions is increasing and has become better and more. And especially here in the UK, people, the positive sentiment towards brands like the BBC and the NHS, which did not enjoy the kind of respect and trust they do now, has emerged. So if you go to the next slide. This is a really interesting way in which some of our, this is something from Belgrade, where, this is a very good example of some communication in Belgrade on how the conversation and culture is about the new heroes. So as you can see, they've superimposed superheroes on health workers. And this was extremely poignant and telegraphic of the sentiment, not just in Belgrade, but I would say in all of Europe, really. And the other thing is, when it comes to purpose, it's no longer enough to just say that this is our purpose. Brands are being held accountable. There's this, everyone knows about this, called Did They Help? And you can find out how a company or a celebrity behaved during the coronavirus pandemic. So we are being looked at. We are being evaluated, and we will not get away with anything, with any kind of indiscretion, especially if you've gone out there, declared there's a reason we exist in the world. And if we don't make good by people, and if we don't live up to our purpose, this will not be a good thing. So it's a really good time, if you don't feel you can, to rather recalibrate, listen, augment, but do not ever think that we could just say something and be and do something that doesn't match up to what we're saying. So we really have to put the money where the mouth is, have the goods to back up the attitude, whatever the expression is. That's the expectation right now. Next slide, please. 77% of people globally believe that brands have a greater ability to create positive change than the government. So the expectation and the responsibility is immense. So it's really something where this isn't something we can afford to get wrong. Okay, next slide, please. The truth really is that when it comes to purpose, the great reset that the coronavirus has inaugurated will drive a collective reassessment of the role that we play in our public, our professional and personal lives. And when I say we, it's not just people and influencers, it's also brands and platforms. Okay, next slide. So the implication is, when I talk about this, I think we talk about brands, businesses, organizations, and leaders, and government leaders, and state leaders, and company leaders, and CEOs, no matter the category. We need to recalibrate their meaningful role across the pandemic journey, which is across all the human needs of from acceptance to denial, to panic, to adapting, to recovery, to renewal. Just understand the human condition at all of them, be able to augment and calibrate how your purpose lives in response to each of those need states, and then help people collectively move into the renewal phase, be an architect of that renewal, and also as much a witness as much as an enabler. So it's a world on edge. I mean, it's a overly simplistic way of summing it up. And there's a lot of scapegoating and blame going on, as you can see in China and in Italy. If you look at these word clouds, people are worried that people are going to become more racist as a result of what's going on. So go to the next slide. This is quite an astounding statistic that 1 in 5 people globally are concerned that people will become more racist as a result of coronavirus. And I just want to preface by saying that this was done, this is a data point that precedes what's happening in our society over the last 2 weeks, or rather what's been happening for a long time, but has been exacerbated over the last 2 weeks, okay? But I'm an optimist, and as human beings, we all are wired to recover, and we're all meant to find our natural state of love and peace. I really do believe that. In fact, the truth is, I don't need research to tell you this, but I just implore you to think about the last time you cut your finger. Anytime we've had any kind of a problem, the human body starts recovering the minute there's a trauma or the minute something goes wrong. So we're wired to be okay. We're wired to recover, and we're wired to be beings who love each other, and love will always find a way. So 1 in 3 people globally say they feel closer to their loved ones as a result of the coronavirus. And I know there's this conversation about there are going to be some COVID divorces and all of that, but at the same time, the relationships that people have had with their near and dear ones, and they don't always have to be a husband, wife, or a significant other, they feel that those relationships have become deeper, and they found a greater sense of appreciation for each other. So you go to the next slide. So in summary, I think the most important thing is, if you have made good by people, and if you have a close relationship with them, this is a good moment for you to kind of, earn your stripes, embed with greater love and authenticity into their lives, and be more meaningful. So really, in summary, what I've talked to you today about is the pandemic journey map, 5 human truths. We talked about 3, but there are 5. There's connection, discovery, purpose, success, and love. If you go to the next slide, and the 3 takeaways I want to leave you with before I thank you for your time. The first one is, when we think about COVID, please track the culture, not the virus. This is the first thing I want to tell anyone who's in research, who is in our business of understanding how people are engaging with their new and evolving reality. Let's track culture, not the virus. The minute we put that as a perspective, we look at the world differently, we look at research differently, we interpret differently. The pandemic affects human beings, not just consumers, most deeply, because consumers are people. And I passionately believe that the only way we can ever move a market is if we move people, because markets are made up of people. So please, let's not lose sight of the fact that as we think about the pandemic and we talk about consumers, let's not forget we're talking about people. So one easy way for me personally is to always say people, not consumers, and that keeps me honest. And the last one I want to talk about is that we have to focus on enduring human values that are expressed in new ways. So there are no new human values. Those 5 human values I talked to you about are the most enduring human values. They are being expressed in new ways. So we have to be attentive and respectful and interested in seeing how they're being expressed and be part of that discourse. Okay, and on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I hope I haven't taken longer than I was supposed to, but it's been really, really fun talking to you.
Thank you so much, Eric, Panos, and Harjot. What a brilliant way to set the human context for the sessions that follow. 1 in 3 people feel that the crisis will inspire new innovations coming out of their chrysalis cocoon to reinvent, reimagine, and recreate. Harjot's road to recovery shows that we are coming out of the trauma, moving through denial, acceptance, from panicking to adapting to recovery and renewal in an optimistic and respectful way. We are not going to go back to how things were. We will change and make adjustments. We will think differently and react differently. We now have a break until 12 noon. But when we do come back, it will be to talk with influential government leaders about getting ready for the upturn and preparing for recovery. We look forward to sharing that with you then. And in the meantime, take a break, relax, do your emails, or go and visit the Createch Expo area. Thanks so much.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.